Titanic. James Cameron's blockbuster film smashed box office records when it released in the Christmas of 1997. For a generation, it brought the ship and its era back to life and transported viewers back in time nearly 100 years. Today, it's fondly remembered as a pop culture icon, and one key reason why the film performed so well was its groundbreaking visual effects. Artists from dozens of backgrounds worked for years to create incredible sights. Conventional hyper-detailed models and spectacular sets were combined with 3D computer graphics to create a feast for the eyes that still holds up to this day. Today, we'll explore the amazing techniques that were used to bring Titanic back to life. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is how they made the movie, Titanic. Probably seen photos of the set being built and operated during the shooting of the film through 1995, 1996, but you may not be fully aware of just how much went into recreating the look of the ship. The set was built in Rosarito at Baja Studios in Mexico, and a lot of the set pieces are actually still there. The facility was built on a budget of $20 million at the time, and has been used to film a ton of films, including another one of my favorites, Master and Commander, and a huge replica of the ship, the HMS Surprise, is still there. They built the Titanic set on a 17 million gallon, 65,300,000 litre water tank. Of course, you want the water tank to be as deep as possible so no one injures themselves if they're falling into the water, but you can't excavate a, 40, 50 foot well across the entire area of this tank. So what they did was excavate a deeper well around the area where the Titanic set would be built, so that then extras, when they were falling from the ship itself during the sinking scenes, would be safe landing in water. But the rest of the tank, it was probably only about waist deep. And to mark the area where the water tank wasn't that deep, they placed dummies and debris and flotsam and jetsam just floating around. And if you keep an eye out in scenes of the movie, you can actually see some of those things just floating there. One oft-repeated claim about the Titanic set is that it was a 90% scaled version of the real ship, and this is kind of true, but also kind of not. The height of the ship, the deck heights, and the scale of things in the vertical axis were 1-to-1. Those are pretty accurate. But it's the length of the ship that they had to scale down. So to do it, they got visual consultant and historian Ken Marshall and his team to look at plans of the Titanic and photographs of the Titanic and figure out where they could take little slivers of the real ship and delete them all the way along and then stitch the ship together. And it worked really well. You can't really tell unless you really know what you're looking for, that there are whole sections of the Titanic that have been made to disappear so that the ship can be shortened in length. But if you look real close, at the front of the ship, you'll see some cutouts for the first class promenade and the deck below on B deck. In real life, these cutouts sat practically on top of each other, but on the set of the film, they're spaced a little bit further apart. It's a very small detail. There are a few little clues like that that only nerds like me would pick up on. The ship's funnels were also scaled down, but they were still massive. I mean, they were sitting at the height of like a 4 or 5 story tall building, so they certainly gave the ship its look. One of the reasons they built the ship's set in Baja in Mexico, apart from the obvious financial benefits, was the fact that that stretch of coastline is fairly windy, and the wind always blows in a predictable direction, which meant when the set's funnels, which had smoke generators in them, were generating that smoke, they wouldn't need fans to blow the smoke in a convincing direction to make the ship look like it was at sea. It was simply the natural wind that would be blowing it the way they wanted it. One thing that was scaled down to fit were the ship's lifeboats. These were a little bit shorter than in real life as well, but they were very solidly built. While most of the set was really decorative and a bit of an illusion, one thing that was fully functional were the replica Welland lifeboat davits. A davit is a kind of crane that ships use to lower lifeboats into the water. And Titanic used these new types of davits called the Welland Quadrant davit, so named after their inventor Axel Welland. Incredibly, the Welland Company still exists. They're an engineering firm, and they got the contract to build replica functional davits for the movie. But they actually had to really beef them up. Even though the real-life Welland davit could easily handle the ton or so weight of a ship's lifeboat, perhaps to ease confidence from the production team, they actually really heavily reinforced the davits for the film. But regardless, when they had the weight of those replica lifeboats, which were still smaller and lighter than the real thing, loaded with extras and crew, swung out over the side of the ship, as they lowered the lifeboats down, the jerky motion of lowering the boats would still have the tops of the davits bouncing up and down as they flexed under the weight. It actually gave Titanic historians a bit of an insight into the events of the real night, because passengers at first were a little reluctant to get into the lifeboats, and you can probably understand why when you see these lifeboats being swung out over the side of a 90-foot, 9-story, almost 30-meter drop straight down, and the cranes that are meant to be lowering the boats are kind of jerking and bouncing up and down. The whole set was built on a steel frame with steel plates. They had decorative rivets, all kinds of decorative details to make it look like the real thing. Hundreds and hundreds of portholes, and thousands of lights. There's about 3,000 light fixtures fed by 30 miles or 48 kilometers of cabling. It was determined there were about 3 times more practical light fixtures used on this set than on the real ship. In fact, James Cameron was installing more lights on the exterior of the ship than were there on the real thing, so as to provide more even lighting for the actors and the events as they were taking place. A pretty famous example of this are the lights shining up on Titanic's funnels in the set. They weren't there in real life on the real thing. Those would have just been shrouded in darkness at nighttime. The ship set was built into 5 sections, and I mentioned it was around about 750 feet long. You had the forwardmost section, which comprised the well deck and the ship's mast. The second section along, which was a pretty important section for the production, we'll get into that in a second, that had the forward 2 funnels. There was a split right down the middle that led into the aftermost sections, to the after 2 funnels, and then the last section, which was the ship's very stern, the poop deck. The reason they had to segment it and split it into these various sections was to actually sink the set. And here's how they did it. So the whole set was built on these support columns. As they wanted to tilt the whole thing down for those kind of long establishing shots showing the ship getting lower and lower in the water, they kept all the sections of the ship together and then kicked away some of the lower portions of those support columns so that when they were filming, the ship would be at the same angle and they could just keep it there while they shot those scenes. But then towards the end of the film, the Titanic's forwardmost section takes a plunge downward. So to do this, they had to reset, isolate the forwardmost section, and have that sink. The second section with the 2 funnels was the part that all the action is focused on as Titanic is taking its final plunge. So that part of the set was built over a 40-foot or 12-meter deep well. There were green screens set up behind it so that the rest of the set wouldn't be picked up on camera. Then the support columns were got rid of and buoyancy blocks were put underneath so it would float for the most part, but then hydraulically actuated cables would be put into place so they could pull the entire set down. The buoyancy blocks would keep it from sinking to the bottom, but they weren't buoyant enough to prevent it from being pulled under by the cables, so they could control the speed at which that entire section of the ship slowly descended into the ocean, providing a very realistic looking and authentic sinking sequence, because the thing was actually sinking. Everything behind that part of the Titanic set couldn't sink, so it was just kept in place. Contrary to popular belief, the interior sets like the grand staircase, the dining saloon weren't actually on this set. This is totally separate. This was only used for exterior shots. The interior sets were built on sound stages in wells themselves, so they too could be slowly pulled under and have water dumped on them from above in the case of the grand staircase scene. What you may not know though is that the set actually collapsed at one point. One of the support legs kicked out and it meant the entire forward section of the ship suddenly dropped down into the well. They got an engineering firm to investigate and they had to drain the entire tank and just kind of check out what was going on. When they emptied it, they found that a support leg had kicked out and the whole set had collapsed and there was some damage. The collapse was caused by a faulty weld and there were actually a couple of bad welds on the set, so they had to completely redo it and then they were able to continue filming. The other major exterior set piece was the very end of the ship at the stern. This was the ship's poop deck set, and right at the very end of the film, as Titanic's stern is being swung up into the air, this entire section of the ship could be separated from the rest of the set and then tilted up. And of course, nowadays, they would just film this on a small section of set against a green screen. But what they did back then, and it's incredible, was tilt this entire thing straight up into the air, like 90 degrees, and then have extras clinging on, obviously supported with cables, but still clinging on as it was pointed straight up in the air. The thing was about 100 feet, say 30 meters or 10 stories tall. If you've ever been to the top of a 10-story building and looked down, yeah, that's kind of the height that these people were dealing with. It would have been terrifying. They had crash mats about a third of the way up to catch anyone if they fell. And the bottom of the entire well where the stern section was sitting was loaded with foam pads. All the major fixtures like the capstans and the bollards and things were just made out of foam. And in the scenes where the ship's sinking, you'd actually see them just bending a little bit when people actually hit them. In this photograph, you can actually see that it's been separated from the rest of the set. You can see just in the background there's the after part of the Titanic with one of the masts. This is the poop deck set has been brought over and put in this well for this scene. It's just insane. They don't make movies like this anymore. And it's a real shame they don't. I know this is a lot of effort, But it's so cool. It looks fantastic. It looks really authentic. I'm really scared of heights, so I don't know that I'd be able to have handled this. As to the rest of the shots of the ship, they used models. They had various scales of models. I think for the breakup, they had a 1/35th scale Titanic model. This is one of the things that I love about the film when people say, oh, I bet you don't like the movie Titanic. I have to say, well, yeah, I do, because it's the movie that can make this look like this. In my opinion, this was the golden age of Hollywood's visual effects. It was like the perfect blend of practical and computer. This is 1996, and they were planning on how they would actually get the ship to break up at the end of the film. And they were testing getting huge segments of models, and then how do you make it break up consistently for multiple takes? What they ended up doing was cladding the exterior of this model in lead plating so that it would slowly buckle as the weight of the ship really broke its back in real life. And if they didn't like the take, they could just apply the lead plating again, reset, and shoot it again. The results were incredible. All in all, it was a pretty incredible effort. It took teams of thousands of people to set up and shoot. And we haven't even gone into the fact that they rebuilt a replica of the city of Southampton and the wharfs right there just to film the departure scenes. That's a whole saga. That's probably worthy of its own video as well. But it's one of my favorite sets in cinema ever. It's not just because I'm a Titanic nerd, it's because the engineering and the patience and time required to actually achieve all of this and make it look that good on screen, truly remarkable. Now, very famously, Cameron pitched the idea of Titanic to Fox Studios executives as a kind of 3-hour-long Romeo and Juliet epic. But the studio was a little bit dubious. You have to remember where Cameron was coming from here. He'd directed movies like Terminator, Alien, and The Abyss, all hard-hitting action films. Those films, especially the franchises, made use of some awesome visual effects that were, for the time, revolutionary. Fox expected Cameron to bring this experience to the table with Titanic. So early on, he had to sit down and figure out how he'd even shoot this movie in the first place. Now, there was precedent. 1953's Titanic and 1958's A Night to Remember had both been filmed in an era where steamships from Titanic's age, or at least close enough to it, still existed and operated across the world, so exterior shots could feature those ships just repainted and subbed in for the Titanic. For example, in A Night to Remember, the port side of the actual British ocean liner RMS Asturias was used as a proxy for Titanic and repainted in White Star Line livery. The starboard side of the ship was being demolished by the shipbreakers because at the time, Asturias was actually being scrapped. By 1995, when Cameron was thinking about making his film, the world's major steamships were gone, so he knew he'd have to start from scratch. Cameron sat down with Rob Legato, visual effects guru from Digital Domain, who had worked on Terminator and more of Cameron's films, to figure out how they'd make the ship come to life off the screen. Now, he asked, in a what-if universe where there were absolutely no budget constraints whatsoever, how they could shoot the movie. And Legato said, you'd do a helicopter move along the ship like we've all seen in cruise ship commercials. Legato recalled that on a film of this magnitude, the unwritten rule is generally to shoot it in a way that has never been seen before. Our philosophy on Titanic was just the opposite. We're all familiar with those helicopter shots. In and of themselves, those types of images, they're not startling, because that's what you'd do if it were real. Jim wanted to sell the audience the illusion of how great it would be to take a trip on the Titanic, so we decided to basically make a commercial for the ship. But here's the question, how do you shoot a commercial for a ship that no longer exists above the ocean? Well, the pair sat down and re-watched A Night to Remember and all the other Titanic films that had been made up to that point, and looked out for the flaws and pitfalls. On this exercise, Legato said, most of the miniature shots involve a model ship on a slow-motion ocean, which looks kind of funky. Miniature vessels have traditionally been populated by stationary figures, tiny puppets, or, in extreme circumstances, like Raise the Titanic, live hamsters in bonnets. Those types of shots are typically fairly wide with limited angles, and you never really see the multitudes of people on deck. We wanted our shots to look a bit more sophisticated. But Cameron and his team had one huge advantage over the previous movies. They had been made too early to enjoy the incredible strides in computer visual effects, which had exploded onto the scene in earnest in the 1990s. Cameron would use CGI to patch up the shots and then fill them in with people to make it seem more real. But the ship had to exist first, and that couldn't just be CGI, so the team would have to start making scale models. Legato knew early on that small-scale models on a slow-motion water tank looked unrealistic. They were fine for the 50s and 60s, but wouldn't do anything for a modern audience. They would have to go big, really big, and it wouldn't be easy. In the movie, Titanic has to sail triumphantly out on its maiden voyage and wow the audience with its size and glamour, and then it has to sink and be violently destroyed during the breakup and final plunge. This couldn't all be done on one model. They had to make a model for daylight external shots, the glamour model, if you will, a model for the breakup, which could actually break in half and be repaired and reset to break up again, and a model for the final plunge when Titanic is violently dragged beneath the surface. Oh, and a model for the wreck sequence as well, because even though Cameron and his team dived Titanic in 1995 to film for the opening sequences, it simply wasn't enough, and they'd need to shoot wider angles with the model. Now next time, we'll look at the models used for the sinking scenes, because they were just incredible, but today, let's just look at the glamour shot model. This thing is a beast, and I say is because it still exists in a warehouse. Legato and his team knew that for the glamour shots, they'd need as big a scale model as possible. And this is because of the audience. We can just tell if something looks off. If a scale miniature is small, we can just kind of tell. Light and shadows fall differently on larger objects, and simply put, the more detail there is on a model, the more realistic it's going to look. On an enormous IMAX screen, millions of viewers would be analysing every inch of the miniature, so it had to be just right. To begin to pull it off, Digital Domain turned to Western Boatworks of California with a brief to create a 45-foot, 13.7 metre long accurate scale replica of the ship. The model would actually be longer than many real leisure sailing yachts, and so it would have to be built like an actual boat. Naval architect Jay Cantola, who had experience designing and building real trimaran sailing boats, worked with Harland & Wolff, Titanic's shipbuilders, to obtain plans of her sister ship, the Olympic, and begin to craft the model. The shape of Olympic's frames were traced and cut out and employed a complex system of planking over frames and stringers, and a team of 6 actual boat builders worked under Cantola's direction to build the basic hull shape in the same way they would build an actual boat. And when it was complete, the whole thing could be handed over to Digital Domain for detailing. This is when the expertise of my personal hero, Ken Marshall, was called in. Ken had worked on the miniatures for other Titanic movies and was quite simply one of the most knowledgeable people in the world when it came to Titanic's construction and appearance. The Digital Domain team worked to layer on all the details: vents, lifeboats with their block and tackle, even the thousands of tiny rivets running along Titanic's hull. The model was about 1/20th scale, and when it was completed, it was simply gorgeous. But with big models, there came some big problems, and in certain cases, visual effects director Eric Nash and his team had to get a little bit creative. He later said that the bigger the miniature, the more it alleviates depth of field problems, but the downside is lighting them, especially in a space that really isn't big enough. That was one of the things we struggled with from the outset on the 45-footer. As soon as we put that 45-foot ship in the big hangar at the Hughes aircraft site in Venice and tried to put our key light far away enough that it looked even and the shadows fell naturally, we quickly ran up against the ceiling or the wall. In the confined spaces we had, it was next to impossible to light the Titanic evenly, so we used multiple key lights for practical and aesthetic reasons. Since the ship was the lead character in the movie, it had to look better than it really would have looked in a single key daylight, so we took some license. For example, the foredeck looked best when it was side-lit, with long raking shadows falling across it. If we applied that same direction of key light to the funnels though, they looked flat and uninteresting, so for those, we cheated the key light more around the back. I'll be the first to admit that anyone with a kind of an eye for lighting will be able to tell that the Titanic's miraculously lit from 2 or more positions, but during the flow of the scene, I don't think most people will notice. This 45-footer is the model used in the famous I'm the King of the World scene, which Cameron had envisaged all the way back in 1995 when he and Legato were talking about shooting the movie as if it were a commercial for the ship. Nash remembered that Jim thought it would be cool to start on a close-up of Leonardo DiCaprio at the bow and then go back the entire length of this 900-foot ship to show that it's basically teeming with life. 1,000 people walking and talking, guys in steerage having a fist fight, parents picking up their children and pointing out how big the smokestacks are. This is the glory moment, but it also sets up the rest of the story. It was a fairly involved process just programming the shot and getting it to have that smooth helicopter feel. It's the first time you get a really good look at the whole ship, both in close-up and in long shot. Now, Nash thought that the original camera position for the scene came ridiculously close to the model. He said that after we shot a test, Cameron said, "Get closer," and our model crew chief, George Stevens, and his team did their finest paint job. They begged us not to get any closer, but the model held up amazingly well. We couldn't even shoot the beauty pass in one piece because it required different lighting and flagging setups for different portions. We actually had 2 shifts shooting that shot. We had to choreograph overlaps as we transitioned from one setup to the next, being very careful about shadows not changing and flags not crossing. Once it was programmed and approved, it took 60 hours of continuous shooting from the time we started rolling the first pass till we were finished, 2.5 days with a 10-man crew at all times. No individual pass lasted more than a couple hours. Most of the work was changing setups and mats. When it was all said and done, they had to scan 9,000 frames of film for all of the various pieces, and that was just the miniature portion. Now, compositing the actors onto the decks of the Titanic was an incredibly laborious process and used what was then a new technology called motion capture. Digital Domain's own employees were shot walking and acting out the motions of Titanic's passengers and crew. They were converted into basic 3D scale people with costumes layered on top. Legato recalled that we built a library of people composed of various portions and movements in which we mixed and matched and altered to make endless walk cycles. At a distance, there are certain details you can't make out, so we used a lot of the same people wearing different coloured costumes and appearing in sunlight or in shadow just to create the impression that these were real, moving people. Fortunately, we didn't have to create computer-generated costumes. We could just generate shells, apply a texture map of real fabric or real costumes that had been photographed conventionally, and then light each figure individually. Now, 2 more filmmaking techniques were used to lend credence to this shot. Previously, all other Titanic films were shot in tanks with slow motion water, but water doesn't scale well for action scenes. We can tell if it doesn't look right. Instead, a fully digital ocean was used with dozens of wake and wave elements layered in to make it look like the 45-foot Titanic model was powering its way through the ocean. Now, the final technique involves the model itself. You'll notice the black part of the hull isn't actually black, but a mix of washed out greys. In fact, all of it is washed out. The whites are actually a light grey colour, the red of the ship's hull is a dull brown. This is a technique designed to mimic the imperfections in the paintwork of an object the size of something like Titanic in real life. If you paint a model ship perfectly, it just won't look right. You need to weather it to copy the way paint fades and scratches on large objects like buildings or ships. Next time you go out, look at the side of a big building which has been painted one colour and see just how many shades of paint you can actually see since the paint begins to fade and chip. And the result was stunning. The model looked about as real as you could get, and the shot was a triumph for the effects team. Today you can still go and see the incredible 45-foot long glamour model used in Titanic. Last I checked, it's kept at Cameron's Lightstorm Entertainment Studios in LA. Well worth a look by the sound of it. The glory shot set up Titanic as the film's main character and lent an air of triumph and excitement to the film's opening act. But of course, the ship would have to eventually be destroyed. First, the team had to figure out how to depict probably the most iconic moment from the Titanic sinking. That's when the Titanic first strikes the iceberg. This fateful encounter had been portrayed dozens of times before on the big screen and on TV, and always in the same way, with vague suggestions of a collision or with stock footage of an iceberg tinted to make it look like nighttime. 1997's Titanic had to be the most convincing depiction of the encounter yet. And pretty early on, the team realised that bigger miniatures were the best way to shoot action scenes because they scaled well against actual water. For the $1 million shot, the model didn't need to be that big. Yes, it was 45 feet long, but that was just for the purposes of getting realistic details onto it and lighting effects that would look realistic. It wasn't big enough to shoot in a real water tank though. Even at 45 feet in length, the water wouldn't be scaled correctly and it'd look fake like in the old Titanic movies. Instead, for the hero shot in the film, the 45-foot long model was put onto a digital ocean which was made up entirely of computer-generated visual effects composited onto each other. The team couldn't do this for the sinking scenes though. Titanic would need to interact with the water as it slipped beneath the waves, and the computer graphics weren't advanced enough to fake it. The miniatures for the sinking scenes would need to be shot in water tanks, and because they would be in real water, they would need to be big. Really, really big. For the iceberg collision sequence, a massive iceberg model was built along with a section of Titanic's bow made of lead plate on a frame. The moment the iceberg is sighted from the Titanic used a miniature of the iceberg too, shot on a green screen with the bow of Titanic green screened on front from one of the models, most likely the 45-foot long hero model, which was the most detailed. The iceberg collision sequence was different though. This would have to be violent and impactful. The plan was simple. Visual effects supervisor Rob Legato explains. We had a pickup truck in the parking lot pulling a 1/4 inch cable, which went in through the stage door, up through pulleys, then connected to the underwater dolly the iceberg rode on because nothing was strong enough to yank this thing at high speed
and actually pierce this metal hull we built. Our camera, which was shooting at 48 FPS, was riding in an underwater camera housing with the iceberg as it impacted the hull. Eric Nash, the director of photography, highlighted the problems encountered by the team while working on this shot with real water. He said, "Water is such a pain in the butt. We had to keep the water clear, but not too clear, and keep the bubbles off the iceberg because as soon as it started to move, the bubbles would give away the scale. Then, when the iceberg split the seams and the lead plates on the hull, James Cameron, wanted to see chunks of ice splintering and falling off. So we were working with this elaborate iceberg that was rigged to break apart, but which had to look like one piece before it hit the hull. Consequently, the model shop had to resculpt the iceberg for each take and mask all the cracks where it would break on impact. Lastly, we were photographing an event that took place on a moonless night, so we had to take some creative license. In reality, it was pitch black out there. We had to light the scene so the audience could see what was going on, but it couldn't look lit or look like it was daylight above water because we had to cut above water in our next shot. The next shot shows water pouring in through a gash ripped into the Titanic's hull plating, and this was done with a Model 2, a 1/4 scale model of the ship's cargo hold, shot in the parking lot of the studio at nighttime. Eric Nash recalled that, to create the effect of water bursting through the hull at high pressure, Mark Knoll built 3 fire hoses into a manifold resembling a mail slot so that we could focus the water to hit the exact spot on the outside of the miniature set. The actual interior walls on Titanic were made up of overlapping steel plates, so the model shop replicated these plates in soft lead. When the water, which was pouring through the manifold at 10 gallons a second, hit the outside of this miniature cargo hold, it ripped the seam in the lead plating and burst into the set. All of this is shot at a high frame rate, 40 frames per second or higher. This is because when played back at the movie's actual frame rate, 24 frames per second, the events on screen are slowed down and it gives them a sense of scale and realism. The final sequence was beautifully done, and it meant that for some time, few miniature effects would be needed. Cameron had built a massive set of the ship over 700 feet long, designed to sink and look as realistic as possible. I covered that in my first video in this series, but there were some shots the set couldn't be used for, specifically the close-ups on the bow as the ship begins to sink below the water.
The set in Mexico was absolutely huge, but only featured the Titanic from about the bridge down.
For shots of the ship beginning to slip beneath the waves, a huge 1/6 scale section of Titanic's bow was recreated in large miniature form, and to a very high degree of accuracy and realism, it was shot in a tank. You can see it in action in these shots here, and most noticeably here, as the Titanic's well deck begins to flood towards the end of the sinking. Most of the sinking scenes from the outside used shots of the incredible set, but the set could only do so much. It could be tilted downwards up to 8 degrees, but couldn't be used for the breakup and final plunge. For that, models would need to be used, and just like in the iceberg sequence, they would need to be big. Really big. For the breakup and final plunge, a 1/4 scale model was used to represent the very stern of the ship. Another larger model, a 1/8 scale miniature of Titanic from about the 3rd funnel down, would be used to depict wider shots of the breakup and plunge. This thing was huge too, absolutely dwarfing the 45-foot-long 120 scale hero model. But here's an interesting fact. The 120 scale hero model was by far the most detailed model of the ship, so it would be used for close-ups of the sinking as the stern is lifted high out of the water. It was cut almost in half, just aft or behind of the 2nd funnel, and mounted on a cradle to rise high into the air at about 45 degrees. This model was used for shots like this, where the detail would need to be sufficient to appear on camera.
Now, today the model is on display in one piece in Los Angeles, and it's a little bit difficult to spot, but if you look carefully, you can just make out where the 2 sections of the ship were put back together.
In this clip, you can see the decking has been patched here, and in this frame, you can see that there's a clear line where the hull plates don't line up. The 1/8 model was different though. It would need to be able to break up just like the real thing and be patched for multiple takes. Then it would need to plunge realistically into the ocean as the stern was dragged underwater. It meant that, unlike the hero model, the breakup model would not be expected to survive shooting. First, the 1/8 scale model was used to depict Titanic as the stern begins to rise up out of the water, showing the propellers. This was all shot in a tank with real water. Rob Legato explains, "We put our 1/8 scale stern on a hydraulic rig. As it was lifted out of the water, we shot the props rising out of the ocean at high speed, around 60 to 72 frames per second, which became the background for the rowboats and people swimming."
So in the movie, all throughout the sinking scenes, different shots and cuts will use models or full-size sets interchangeably. Here's a quick breakdown of just a short 50 seconds or so of one whole sinking sequence.
Essentially, any far shots of the stern rising used the 120 scale hero model cut in half, and the water had to be added digitally and faked. You can tell if you zoom in on this shot of the sinking that it kind of fades over the Titanic's deck and doesn't look entirely convincing under close scrutiny. Of course, the people were added later digitally, animated by motion capture, using dozens of stunt performances.
And then there came the most dramatic moment of the sinking, the breakup.
For this, the 1/8 scale model was used. The section of the ship forward of the breakup area was built too, but not a lot of it because it would be invisible beneath the water. The two sections were joined together with soft lead plating again that was expected to deform and tear in a realistic way when the hull, which was raised and held at a 45-degree angle, had its supports removed. Then came the breakup. Rob Legato explained, Mark's guys had to support the 1/8 scale stern just back of the breaking point at a 45-degree angle, then let it go. When the ship broke, the hydraulic rig dropped the stern in the water and made a huge splash.
The ship's hull hitting the ocean had to appear immensely powerful.
Cameron's brief was that it should look like God's boot heel was crushing down on the people in the water. It was shot at 70 frames per second to capture every detail in slow motion as the stern dropped down and created a monstrous wave. The shot looks really good because it was filmed from flattering angles with quick cuts. But it's here, if you freeze, that you'll notice the water droplets are way too big and it's clearly a miniature in action.
Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not pointing out these flaws to denigrate or criticize the movie unnecessarily. I absolutely love these practical effects.
They don't really make movies like this anymore very often. But by pointing out the very few imperfections, it gives you an idea of how the shots were composed in the first place and shows how the whole thing was put together. Finally came time for the ship's final plunge. For this, the 1/8 scale model was mounted at 90 degrees and would be dragged under into a pool with cameras mounted at various angles. But the tank couldn't be so deep as to allow for the whole model to sink in one take over and over again, so instead it would be sunk for a section at a time, then raised and about 10 feet of the model would be cut off. The process was repeated again and again until only the very tip of the ship's stern and the propellers were left. The shots shown from the main character's viewpoint from atop the rail were accomplished by filming the stern set tilted to 90 degrees against a green screen. The ship scene forward of this is variously the 1/8 scale model disappearing beneath the water, or the 1/20th scale hero model up in the air. Finally, as the very end of the ship begins to go under, the quarter scale stern model was used because the size of its detail matched perfectly with the full-size set in Mexico. The 1/6 bow section, the 1/8 and quarter scale stern sections were all made masterfully by both Cameron's visual effects team at Digital Domain and the team of legendary studio model maker Don Pennington.
Now, while the hero model remains stitched back together and intact on display in Los Angeles, there's nothing really left of the 1/6, 1/8 or 1/4 scale models.
After the movie was finished, Cameron kept the hero model, but the rest of the props and model remnants were left behind for any of the crew to take as souvenir. Presumably, anything left behind was broken up for scrap. I've seen a few interesting items pop up for auction though. Here's a green winch from the 1/6 scale bow section, actually signed by model maker Don Pennington. There's also this anchor, most likely also from the 1/6 scale bow section. Here's a deck vent which came up for auction. It's from the 1/8 scale breakup and final plunge model. And here's a section from one of the stern models showing the railing and iconic propeller notice warning sign. Definitely the coolest piece I found from the 1/8 model though is this intact funnel. The thing's 40 inches or 100 centimeters tall.
It'll look great in the corner of my office over there, but unfortunately it went under the hammer at auction and sold for 10,000 British pounds, or 12,000 US dollars. Better luck next time.